Hey everybody. So in this video we're going to talk about the three main research strategies that social psychologists use to study human social behavior. All right, so I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint here to give you a visual aid. All right, here we go. So the first first I guess we can talk about, give you a overview of what we were talking about. So the first kind of research method that we use is observational, are classified as observational methods. All right, and these kinds of methods really just describe. This is when we're just trying to, describe the experience or describe what happens. We might be trying to count up, see how frequently something happens. The polls that we hear about so frequently, given that we're in an election year. All right, those are the results of descriptive or observational research. All right. We also have correlational methods. Now, correlational methods go beyond observational methods in that they start tapping how variables are related to one another. And that's the primary focus of correlational methods, identifying relationships. But with correlational methods, we can't identify exactly how they're related. We can establish that they're related. As one goes up, the other does, or as one goes up, the other goes down. We can establish relationships with correlational methods, but we can't establish, at least very easily, and certainly not definitively, causality. We can't establish that one variable causes another. All right, you've probably heard, and it's probably almost become a mantra, or if it hasn't, it probably will, that correlation does not equal causation. And that's certainly true, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is. But if we want to get to the point of establishing exactly how they're related, so are they causally related? Does one of our variables cause the other? Then we have to use experimental methods, and that's their purpose, is to establish causation, to establish that one variable causes another. And we'll talk in this video how they're able to do that. So let's first talk about observational methods. Like I mentioned, observational methods are all about describing. All right. So like those polls, so what percentage of the population approve of the president? What percentage of the population say that they're going to vote? What percentage of the population have completed the U.S. Census? All right, these are just describing behavior. All right, what percentage of homicides are committed by men? Or what percentage? So these are just frequencies. These are just descriptive. All right, they just describe behavior. Okay. They view or count those behaviors, and so we can get percentages and frequencies and things like that. Sometimes we might be interested in kind of unique or unusual behaviors. I have a lot of students, I have had friends in the past, including myself a little bit, that are interested in cults and extreme beliefs and serial killers, right? These are unusual, right? And so we might observe things about these individuals. Sometimes we might want to learn about a group that has extreme beliefs or unusual beliefs or atypical beliefs. And so we might go into their culture and act as an observer. Sometimes, because of the nature of those cultures, we have to kind of disguise the fact that we're an observer. We have to act like we're actually a member. But whether it's disguised or not, when we're observing a group from the inside, that's an ethnography. All right, we're going and joining the group. Now, maybe not necessarily officially, like I said, you might join as an observer, and then you're observing it from the inside. All right, you're observing their customs, their social behaviors. But again, you're not identifying explanations for their behaviors. You're just describing them. Okay, what did they do? What did they do when such and such happened? You can't say that whatever happened, whatever the such and such was, you can't say that that caused their behavior. You can just say that it followed it. All right. We might also do archival analyses. So earlier when I was mentioning, what percentage of of homicides are committed by men, right? You go look at the homicide rates, right? That's an archival analysis. Anytime you're going back into prior records and looking up the number of times certain things happened, That's an archival analysis. And these are both observational methods. And we see them used. In fact, every now and then they can be a nice little addition to a series of studies showing or offering some explanation for human behavior. It can kind of sometimes offer a little bit of evidence on a societal level or a larger scale for some explanation for human behavior. But again, observational methods don't and aren't able to tell us why something happens. All right. Sometimes they can provide little hints. Sometimes they can provide if you have an explanation of behavior, if you have an explanation of human behavior, and you would predict certain kind of societal events, then you can go do an archival analysis and see if that behavior is there. And then that serves as evidence for your explanation, but you can't actually say what has caused what. It's just a little piece that says, hey, maybe our explanation's right. Now, when observational methods have certain limitations, we've already talked about the biggest limitation, and that is no causality, all right? But there are other limitations. Earlier we mentioned cults and homicide or serial killers, right? Extreme beliefs. These are rare and many times private, right? I don't think a serial killer wants you to know that they're killing a lot of people. That's private and rare, all right? A lot of times cults are fairly exclusive. They won't let just anybody join, all right? So a lot of times the things that we care about, that we want to observe, that we want to learn about, they're not easy to do. They're not easy to observe. And so that makes observational research harder. Observational research is great for ecological validity. It's happening, all right? You're observing it happening. So does it happen in the real world? Absolutely, because you're observing it. But it's terrible for what we call internal validity, which is identifying the cause of that behavior, okay? Now, again, remember, correlational methods are those designed to assess relationships between variables. So let's say I want to know whether people who have a lot of support from their family are more or less prone to experiencing depression. Well, correlational methods can help me with that. I can assess either by written questionnaire or by observation, or, I mean, that might be ethically questionable, but depending on the circumstances, it'd be fine, I imagine. Specifically, you might invite the whole family into the clinic and then observe how they interact. But regardless of how you measure it, you can measure how much support a person has and then measure their depressive symptomology. Got tongue tied on that one. Sorry, guys. Now, one of the limitations of correlational methods is, again, we can't make a causal statement. We can't say that social support causes less depression. We can't do that. And the reason for that is because of the problem of the infamous third variable. The problem of the third variable is when the possibility exists that some third variable that we haven't considered is actually either the cause for both of the things that we have observed. So there might be some outside variable outside of social support and depression that causes both. So if we find that those with greater social support have less depression, then there may actually be, or sorry, I said cause. Let's say that we find that social support is related to less depression, right? Well, if we found that correlation, we can't say that social support causes less depression, because there's the possibility that there's some variable outside of our study that we haven't looked at that actually causes both of them, all right? Or it may be the issue that social support doesn't actually do anything to depression directly, all right? It instead affects something else, which then that something else, that third variable, affects depression. So the infamous third variable problem refers to the fact that there could be some third, but it really could be a, could be a fourth, fifth, sixth. It could be any number of additional variables that we have not looked at and we have not assessed that could be responsible for this correlation or covariation between social support and depression. And because correlation has no method, no capability to tell you if social support causes depression, we can't rule out any of those third variables. Now, before we go on, it might be helpful to review what you do need to make a causal statement. All right. Well, you need at least three things. First, you do need evidence that the two covary. You need evidence that they are correlated. All right. So the two things need to be correlated. They need to be covary. The causer must precede in time the caused. All right. So what's what's having an effect must come before what it's having an effect on. And third, there can't be any alternative explanations. Okay. Well, correlation only gives you one of those. All right. It doesn't give you the other two, and it can't. All right. Sometimes you can tackle the second one a little bit. All right, because you might measure. So let's say you wanted to say social support causes less depression. Well, you could measure social support before you measured depression, but more than likely that still doesn't, but that in this specific example, that still doesn't give you any real evidence that social support, because you're measuring them, doesn't give you any evidence that social support comes before depression. So it doesn't tackle that second. So in that example, you don't get that second. So with correlational methods, you've got to work extra hard, and only in certain circumstances can you get that second ingredient. And you can start chipping away at the third ingredient, the ruling out alternative hypotheses. You can do it various ways that we won't go into here. But what is necessary for you to understand is that of those three things you need to make a causal statement, correlation only reliably gives you one. And the other two you can't get from correlation. And that's where experiments come in. All right? And experiments are for the purpose of explanation. Experiments are designed for the purpose of helping us identify what causes what. So in experiments, we have a special kind of predictor or predicting variable called an IV, an independent variable. It's independent because it's independent of any of the other variables in the study. Whether it's high or low, whether it's 1 or 0, it's independent of any other variable in the study. Now, it's dependent on us, the experimenter, because we change it, but it's independent of anything else in the study. And in experiments, we have a unique kind of outcome called a DV, or a dependent variable. It's called a dependent variable because if we're right, variance in it, whether it's high or low, 1 or 0, should depend on the change we've created in the independent variable. All right. Now, a couple key elements exist with an experiment that don't exist with correlational or observational methods that help it tackle all three ingredients. One is the manipulation of an IV. We change the IV. All right. Some people get a control, some people get an experimental. All right. Not everybody gets both. All right. Sometimes you might do what's called a within subjects variable, but even then, you're manipulating what order they get it in. Experiments allow us to manipulate the IV. So that gives us, if we find that our DV changes depending upon what experimental condition we've put them in, control or experimental condition of our IV, then we have the first two ingredients. All right, we have them covarying. Increases in our DV should covary with either being a member of the experimental group or being a member of the control group. And our IV always has to come before our DV. It proceeds in time. So we've got the first two ingredients right there. All right. Now, the way we get the third ingredient in an experiment is by balancing the groups of people in each of our IV conditions. All right. And so we do that primarily through something called random assignment. This is when we take a random sample of people and then we randomly put them in each of our groups. Now, why do we do this? Well, very oftentimes when people, and you might even do this as you read this through the book, you'll say, well, what about, you might find out that, people who are rejected, even when being rejected is beneficial, um, still report feeling hurt. And you might think, well, maybe that's just because, some people want to belong more than others. And so there might be some people for whom it doesn't matter. So what you've done is you've identified an individual difference, those who need to belong more. All right. And so you might be inclined to think, well, hey, this study may not be true because it's not going to be the same for everybody. Well, if the study has used random assignment, then what you've just identified as an alternative explanation, tackling that third piece, won't matter. Why? Well, if I've taken a random sample of people, then that means I've got a certain proportion of people who really need to belong and a certain proportion of people who really don't need to belong in that sample. Now, if I randomly assign to my rejection condition and my control condition, then both those that get rejected and those who don't, there's going to be an equivalent number of people who need to belong and who don't, that are rejected and who are not. And so any effect, any influence that needing to belong might have on the DV is going to be completely removed. It's going to be balanced out. All right. So random assignment tackles that third piece. Remember the three pieces, right? So we've got, they need to be correlated. The IV and DV need to be correlated. The second piece is it needs to come before, the IV needs to come before the DV. So what's having the effect, the causer must come before what's being affected, the caused. And the third, no alternative explanations can remain. So you manipulate your IV, and it affects your DV. That tackles the first two. You randomly assign, that tackles the third. Because individual differences, like needing to belong in a rejection study, gets ruled out. It gets balanced. You get an equivalent number of people who need and who do not need to belong in both of your experimental conditions. So because of these features, manipulation of an IV and random assignment, an experiment and experimental methods are able to tackle all three of those things necessary to make a causal statement, whereas correlational methods and observational methods aren't able to do that. All right, guys, that's it for this video. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. But if not, then have a great one, and I'll see you next time.